Robert Mitchell woke before dawn to the familiar sound of Nala's paws padding across the wooden floor of his bedroom, her 6 5-week-old puppies tumbling playfully behind her in the hallway. 20 minutes later, a deafening crack of thunder shook the house as the storm intensified, and Robert found Nala barking frantically at the back door, her behavior unlike anything he'd seen since Sarah's accident. 8 months had passed since he'd lost his wife to the icy roads that February night, each day a battle against the emptiness she left behind. When he finally opened the door to quiet Nala's desperate barking, what he saw through the sheets of Louisiana rain made his blood run cold. A small, soaked body collapsed against his fence, ribs protruding through patchy fur. And as Nala leapt the barrier without hesitation, Robert realized this wasn't just any dog, but a pit bull puppy, the very breed that had been banned in Oak Ridge after the attacks. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Oak Ridge. Louisiana sat precariously in the lowlands 20 miles from the Gulf, a town of faded charm where everyone knew not just your name, but your business too. During hurricane season, which seemed to stretch longer each year, the town held its collective breath as the waters inevitably rose. The Mitchell place stood on a modest rise along Cypress Lane, just high enough to avoid the worst flooding but close enough to worry when the big storms came. Robert Mitchell had returned to his hometown after 30 years of military service, the last decade spent training K-9 units before shrapnel in his left leg forced retirement. At 58, his once dark hair had given way to steel gray, and the lines around his eyes told stories of both laughter and pain. The nightmares from his final deployment still visited 3 nights a week, less now than before Sarah's steady presence had helped quiet them. Since losing her, the PTSD had returned with a vengeance, leaving him dependent on Nala's uncanny ability to sense his episodes before they consumed him. Nala had come into their lives 3 years earlier, a rescue from a puppy mill raid where she'd been kept in deplorable conditions. The German shepherd's intelligent amber eyes had connected with Robert's immediately, a wounded soul recognizing another. Sarah had insisted they adopt her despite the work it would take to rehabilitate her. "She needs us, Bobby," Sarah had said, using the nickname only she was allowed. "And I think you need her too." She'd been right, as usual. After Sarah's death, Nala had become his anchor, especially after surprisingly birthing a litter of puppies, a joy amid his grief. Eleanor Thompson lived in the blue Victorian across the street, a widow herself who'd moved to Oak Ridge to help raise her grandson Michael after the boy's father died overseas. Eleanor served as the head of the Neighborhood Safety Committee and had been the most vocal advocate for the town's pit bull ban last year after Michael had been bitten by one. The relationship between Robert and Eleanor had grown increasingly strained since the ban passed. Sheriff David Anderson had gone to high school with Robert before their paths diverged. Robert to the Army, David staying to protect the town they'd grown up in. Now in his 50s, with a perpetually sunburned face, David enforced the laws with a pragmatic flexibility, except when Eleanor's committee pressure left him no choice. The pit bull ban was one such ordinance, controversial but strictly enforced after 3 separate incidents had divided the town. The storm had intensified throughout the night, pelting Robert's roof with rain that sounded like marbles being dropped from the heavens. Lightning illuminated his bedroom in harsh flashes, each followed by thunder that seemed to shake the foundation of his home. It was the kind of storm that made him think of Sarah. She'd always loved watching the lightning from their covered porch, counting the seconds between flash and boom to calculate the storm's distance. Today marked 8 months since the accident. 8 months since the sheriff had shown up at his door, hat in hand, with news that Sarah's car had slid off Devil's Curve during an unexpected ice storm. Robert had been at the VA hospital that night for a PTSD support group meeting. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him seeking help for his demons while his world collapsed elsewhere. Robert had been sitting at his kitchen table with his third cup of coffee, surrounded by Nala's puppies playing on the linoleum floor, when the German Shepherd's behavior suddenly changed. She'd been a calm, attentive mother to her litter of 6. But something outside had caught her attention. Her ears perked forward, her body tensed, and she abandoned her breakfast to pace anxiously between the back door and Robert. "What is it, girl?" Robert asked, pushing himself up with a grimace as his bad leg protested. The morning's humidity always made the old injury throb. Nala's whining grew more insistent, punctuated by sharp barks, her alert signal, one she'd been trained to use during her brief stint as a service dog candidate before Sarah had adopted her. Something was wrong outside, and she wanted Robert to know. When the barking became frantic, Robert finally relented. All right, he muttered, limping to the back door. Rain immediately pelted his face as he opened it, the wind nearly yanking the handle from his grasp. That's when he saw it. A small, sodden heap collapsed against his fence. At first, he thought it might be a raccoon or a possum seeking shelter, but Nala's behavior told him otherwise. Without hesitation, the German Shepherd bolted past him into the downpour, leaping the 3-foot fence with surprising agility for a dog who'd given birth just weeks earlier. "Nala, get back here," Robert called, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. He watched in disbelief as Nala approached the motionless form with unexpected gentleness. His military training kicked in, and he moved despite the rain, despite his throbbing leg. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer. A puppy. Not much older than Nala's own litter, but different. The patchwork of wet fur revealed a distinctive broad head and muscular build, even in its emaciated state. A pit bull, in Oak Ridge, where they'd been banned after Michael Thompson's attack last year. Robert's first instinct was caution. He'd seen what fighting dogs could do, had even helped train military personnel to handle aggressive canines. But this wasn't an aggressor. This was a victim, its ribs protruding painfully through its skin, one eye swollen shut, shivering violently in the rain. Before Robert could decide what to do, Nala made the decision for him, with the same gentle grip she used for her own puppies. She carefully took the scruff of the pit bull puppy's neck between her teeth and lifted. The puppy didn't resist, too weak, perhaps, or somehow sensing Nala's intent wasn't to harm. "Nala!" "Drop it," Robert commanded, the old training phrase emerging automatically. But Nala paid no attention, carrying the puppy back toward the fence, then looking expectantly at Robert when she realized she couldn't jump it while carrying her burden. Something in her eyes, trust, perhaps, or pleading, broke through Robert's hesitation. He reached over the fence and carefully took the soaked puppy from Nala's mouth. It weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones wrapped in wet fur. Up close, Robert could see the cuts and scars that told a story of neglect, or worse. "Christ," he muttered, cradling the puppy against his chest as he hurried back to the house, Nala following closely behind. Her mission accomplished. Inside, Robert grabbed a clean towel from the laundry room and gently dried the trembling puppy. Under the kitchen lights, the damage was even more apparent. Old scars crisscrossed its flank. One ear was partially torn, and patches of fur were missing entirely. Despite its condition, the puppy hadn't made a sound beyond labored breathing. "Eleanor's going to have a field day with this," Robert said to Nala, who had positioned herself protectively beside the newcomer. Her own puppies approached cautiously, sniffing with curiosity at the stranger their mother had brought home. Robert knew he should call animal control. The ordinance was clear: no pit bulls or pit bull mixes were allowed within town limits. But as Nala began to gently clean the puppy with her tongue, just as she did with her own litter, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: purpose. Clear, undeniable purpose. "Just until the storm passes," he told himself, knowing even as he said it that Sarah would have already been naming the poor creature. The morning after the storm, Robert examined the pit bull puppy more carefully in the soft light filtering through his kitchen windows. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, leaving behind the thick, swampy humidity that characterized Louisiana summers. With gentle hands, Robert turned the puppy, noting each injury and sign of neglect. The creature couldn't have been more than 4 months old, yet its body told a story of systematic cruelty. "What happened to you, little one?" Robert murmured, running his finger along a partially obscured collar hidden beneath matted fur. It was worn leather, cracked and stained, with a small metal tag that had been deliberately filed down, leaving only a partial inscription, SR7, and what looked like the beginning of a phone number. Nala hovered nearby, watching with attentive eyes, occasionally nudging Robert's hand with her nose as if ensuring he was being gentle enough. Her puppies had formed a semicircle around them, unusually quiet, as though they sensed the gravity of the situation. "This isn't just an abandoned dog," Robert said to Nala. "Somebody did this deliberately." The decision to take the puppy to a vet was risky. Dr. Linda Hayes ran the only veterinary clinic in Oak Ridge, and she was bound by town ordinances to report any pit bulls she treated. But the puppy's labored breathing and obvious malnourishment left Robert no choice. He made the call and was relieved when Linda herself answered. "I've got an emergency," Robert explained, deliberately vague. "Can I bring it in before regular hours?" Something in his tone must have conveyed the urgency, because Linda agreed without hesitation. "Come through the back. I'll be there in 20. Robert wrapped the puppy in a clean towel and placed it in a small carrier. Nala paced anxiously as he prepared to leave, whining softly. "Stay with your puppies," Robert instructed her firmly. "I'll be back soon." The drive to the veterinary clinic took him down Cypress Lane, past Eleanor Thompson's Victorian home. Robert noticed with unease that Eleanor was already on her front porch, binoculars in hand, ostensibly for bird-watching, though everyone in town knew they were equally used for neighborhood surveillance. He hunched lower in his seat, hoping the carrier wasn't visible through his truck windows. Dr. Hayes was waiting at the back entrance, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a hasty ponytail. Her expression shifted from professional concern to wariness as Robert revealed the contents of the carrier. "Robert," she said carefully, "you know I can't." "Please, Linda." Robert interrupted. "Just examine him. Whatever you decide after that, I'll accept." The examination room smelled of antiseptic and pet shampoo. Linda moved with practiced efficiency, examining the puppy's eyes, ears, teeth, and palpating its abdomen. Her professional demeanor cracked when she turned the puppy over to examine its underside. "My God," she whispered. "These aren't just neglect marks." Robert leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Linda pointed to a series of small circular burns along the puppy's hindquarters and a pattern of scarring around its neck. "These are fight training markers. Someone was preparing this puppy for dog fighting. See these burns? They're used to make them aggressive. And these neck scars come from being chained too tightly, probably to build neck muscles." Robert felt bile rise in his throat. During his military years, he'd seen animal cruelty in various forms, but the deliberate conditioning of a puppy for violence struck him as particularly heinous. "Can you help him?" he asked. Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Medically, yes. He's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and has an infection in that right eye. But Robert, you know I have to report this. The ordinance was created to protect people from dangerous dogs." Robert finished. "Does this look like a dangerous dog to you?" The puppy chose that moment to lift its head weakly, its one good eye meeting Linda's. She sighed deeply. "Give me 48 hours, she said finally. "I'll treat him. But he can't stay here. Sheriff Anderson checks my records every week since the ban. If you take him home, keep him inside. If Eleanor Thompson spots him, you'll have the entire neighborhood safety committee on your doorstep before lunch." Robert nodded, gratitude washing over him. "I understand. Thank you." "What are you calling him?" Linda asked as she prepared an IV for fluids. Robert hadn't thought about a name. It seemed presumptuous, given the temporary nature of the arrangement. But looking at the puppy's resilience despite its condition, he thought of the storm that had brought them together. "Storm," he said. "His name is Storm." Back at home, Robert created a makeshift bed next to Nala's puppies using an old blanket of Sarah's, a choice that felt right somehow. Nala immediately began cleaning Storm again, paying special attention to the areas where Linda had administered injections. Robert was administering the antibiotic Linda had provided when a sharp knock at his front door made him freeze. Through the window, he could see Sheriff David Anderson's patrol car parked in his driveway. "Damn it," Robert muttered, quickly covering Storm with a light blanket. "Stay," he instructed Nala, who positioned herself protectively in front of both her puppies and the newcomer. David Anderson's expression was apologetic but firm as Robert opened the door. "Morning, Robert," he said, removing his hat. "Got a call from Eleanor Thompson. Says she saw you taking a pit bull to Linda's clinic." Robert's jaw tightened. "Since when does Eleanor Thompson dictate police priorities in this town?" David sighed. "You know how it is. After what happened to Michael, the town council gave her committee real teeth. I'm just doing my job, checking it out." "You want to come in and look around?" Robert challenged. The sheriff studied his old friend's face. "I don't want to do that, Robert, but I will if I have to. Is there a pit bull on the premises?" The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Robert had never lied to David, not in 40 years of friendship. "I found a puppy half dead in my yard after the storm," Robert admitted. "He needed medical attention. Linda's treating him." David's eyes closed briefly in frustration. "You know the ordinance? No exceptions? Not even for strays?" "He's got 48 hours before he's well enough to move," Robert said, the statement somewhere between an explanation and a challenge. "After that, I'll find somewhere outside the county line for him." The sheriff adjusted his hat, considering. 48 hours, he repeated finally. Not a minute more, and keep him out of sight. Eleanor's watching this place like a hawk. Don't make me come back with a warrant. Robert! As David turned to leave, the weatherman's voice drifted from the radio in his patrol car. Tropical depression forming in the Gulf expected to strengthen to hurricane status within 72 hours. Residents of coastal parishes should begin preparation for possible evacuation. The two men's eyes met in understanding. If a hurricane was coming, Robert's 48-hour deadline suddenly carried additional weight. "I'll be back," David said simply, before walking to his car. As Robert closed the door, he heard the unmistakable whimper of Storm from the living room, followed by Nala's gentle, responsive whine. Despite the looming deadline and approaching storm, Robert felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. It was time to find out where Storm had come from, and who had done this to him. The partial inscription on Storm's collar, SR7, nagged at Robert throughout the afternoon. After settling the puppy comfortably among Nala's litter, he retreated to Sarah's old home office, a room he'd barely entered since her death. The space remained exactly as she'd left it, grant proposals for the local animal shelter stacked neatly on the desk. A half-empty cup of tea fossilized with an 8-month-old residue, and her laptop still closed beside a notepad filled with her flowing handwriting. Robert hesitated at the threshold, his hand gripping the doorframe as memories washed over him. Sarah had been the animal advocate, not him. She'd have known exactly what to do with Storm, who to call, how to navigate the town ordinances while doing what was right. Drawing a deep breath, he stepped inside. The laptop password came to him after only 2 attempts their anniversary, followed by Nala's adoption date. Sarah had always been sentimental about such things. Opening her browser history felt like an invasion, but Robert pushed aside his discomfort. This was about helping Storm, something Sarah would have prioritized above privacy. A quick search for SR7 dog tag yielded nothing useful. Robert expanded his search, looking for any local dog registries, breeding programs, or service animal training facilities that might use such a coding system. After an hour of fruitless searching, he leaned back in Sarah's chair, frustrated. The sound of tires on gravel drew his attention to the window. A battered blue pickup had pulled into his driveway, Dr. Hayes' vehicle. Robert hurried to the front door, meeting her before she could knock. "Thought I'd check on our patient," Linda said by way of greeting. Medical bag in hand, she lowered her voice. "And I wanted to talk where there's no chance of being overheard." Robert ushered her inside, leading her to the living room where Storm lay among Nala's puppies. The scene before them gave Linda pause. Nala had positioned herself so that Storm's head rested against her flank, while her own puppies played nearby, occasionally approaching the newcomer with curious sniffs. "Well, that's unexpected," Linda murmured, kneeling to examine Storm. "Usually, mother dogs are protective of their litters around strange dogs, especially males. Nala's been like this since we found him," Robert explained. "Almost like she recognizes him somehow." Linda checked Storm's vitals and changed his bandages with efficient movements. "The antibiotics are working his fevers down, but he's still severely undernourished." She glanced up at Robert. "That's actually what I came to talk about. The blood work I ran showed something concerning." She pulled a folder from her bag, opening it to reveal lab results. "See these elevated markers? They indicate long-term steroid use. Whoever had Storm was doping him. It's common in dogfighting circles." They pump puppies full of steroids to accelerate muscle growth, make them more aggressive. Robert felt a surge of anger. He's just a puppy. A puppy from valuable fighting lines, I'd guess, Linda added, her voice grim. Which brings me to what else I found. She pulled out a small evidence bag containing tiny metal fragments. These were embedded in his paw pads. I had a tech friend analyze them. They're metal shavings from a specific type of training platform used in underground fights. The platforms are coated with these shavings to improve a dog's pain tolerance and footing during fights. Jesus, Robert muttered. The platform has a manufacturer's mark. Linda continued. It's used primarily by an operation that's been moving around the Louisiana-Texas border. The sheriff's department has been trying to locate them for months. Robert's military mind quickly connected the dots. You think Storm escaped from this operation? Linda nodded. Or was dumped when they realized he wouldn't be a fighter, despite everything they did to him. This dog doesn't have the aggressive temperament they look for. Look at him now, even in pain. He's gentle. As if to illustrate her point, one of Nala's smallest puppies tumbled over to Storm, pouncing playfully on his tail. Instead of snapping, Storm simply turned his head and gently nudged the puppy with his nose. I've notified animal control about the evidence, Linda said, watching the interaction. But I didn't mention where I found it. That buys you a little time. After Linda left, Robert returned to Sarah's office with renewed purpose. This time, he searched for information about dogfighting operations in Louisiana. The results made him sick. Dozens of busts over the past year, hundreds of dogs rescued, but many more still suffering. One article mentioned an operation called Southern Royalty, known for tattooing SR, followed by a number on their prized breeding dogs. SR7, Robert whispered. Southern Royalty, dog number 7. A knock at the door interrupted his research. Expecting it to be the sheriff, or perhaps Linda, returning, Robert was surprised to find James Walker standing on his porch. James was a freelance journalist who'd moved to the area 3 years ago to document environmental changes in the bayou. He'd occasionally joined Robert for coffee at the local diner, their conversations ranging from military service. James had been a combat photographer in Iraq to the town's stubborn resistance to change. Heard you might need some help, James said without preamble, his voice low. Linda called me. Robert hesitated. Better come inside. Once the door was closed, James explained. I've been tracking the Southern Royalty operation for a year now, not just for environmental stories. I'm working on an expose about dogfighting in the region. Linda thought your new guest might be connected. Robert led James to the living room, where Storm had actually managed to stand up, wobbling slightly as he interacted with Nala's puppies. James whistled softly. That's definitely one of theirs. The scarring pattern is distinctive. He pulled out his phone, showing Robert photographs of recovered fighting dogs with similar marks. Their main operation moves around, but I've narrowed it down to somewhere near Thibodeau Swamp, about 30 miles south of here. You've been there? Robert asked. Close enough to document some of their activities, not close enough to get exact coordinates, James admitted. These people are dangerous. Robert, they've got connections in law enforcement in at least 2 parishes. That's partly why they've been so hard to shut down. Robert absorbed this information, thinking of Sarah. She'd been advocating for stronger animal protection laws right up until her accident. This was exactly the kind of fight she would have taken on. The hurricane that's building in the Gulf, Robert said slowly. It's going to hit that area, isn't it? James nodded. Dead on, according to the latest projections. They'll be moving their operation and their dogs. If we're going to find evidence of where Storm came from, it needs to be before the storm hits. Robert raised an eyebrow. You were Force Recon, right? I could use someone with your skills, and something tells me you're not planning to just hand that puppy over to animal control when your 48 hours are up. Robert was about to respond when he noticed a figure moving across his front yard, Eleanor Thompson, her gait purposeful as she approached his door. James followed his gaze and quickly stepped away from the window. Your neighbor? James asked. The head of the committee that pushed through the pit bull ban, Robert confirmed. And she's not here to borrow sugar. The doorbell rang, its cheerful tone at odds with the tension that suddenly filled the room. Robert gestured for James to stay with the dogs while he answered. Eleanor Thompson stood on his porch, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the humidity, a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands. Behind her, Robert could see several members of her neighborhood safety committee waiting by the street. Mr. Mitchell, she began formally, as though they hadn't been neighbors for years. It has come to our attention that you're harboring a banned breed on your property. Robert maintained a neutral expression. Good morning to you, too. Eleanor, she pursed her lips. This isn't a social call. We have reliable information that you brought a pit bull to Dr. Hayes's clinic yesterday morning. As you know, Ordinance 14B explicitly prohibits. I'm aware of the ordinance, Robert interrupted. I'm also aware that Sheriff Anderson has already visited and the situation is being handled according to the law. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. The committee feels the sheriff has been lenient in his enforcement. We're here to conduct a community safety inspection. You have no legal authority to enter my home, Robert stated flatly. Perhaps not personally, Eleanor conceded. But Section 3 of the ordinance allows for community inspection with reasonable suspicion. We've already contacted the town council. They're sending an official inspector this afternoon. She glanced at her watch. Around 4 o'clock. I believe. Robert felt a surge of anger but kept his voice level. This feels rather personal. Eleanor. Something flickered across her face, pain, perhaps, or anger of her own. My grandson still has nightmares about that attack, Mr. Mitchell. Every child in this town deserves to feel safe. If that's personal, so be it. As Eleanor turned to leave, she added over her shoulder, Oh, and you should know the evacuation order for low-lying areas goes into effect tomorrow noon. The storm's been upgraded to a Category 3 hurricane. She gestured toward the bayou behind Robert's property. Your area is in Zone B. I'd start packing, if I were you. After she left, Robert returned to find James on his knees beside Storm, examining the puppy's partially healed wounds. Town inspector coming at 4, Robert informed him, and apparently a hurricane evacuation tomorrow. James nodded thoughtfully. 2 problems, 1 solution. We need to move Storm tonight, not just for his safety, but to establish where he came from before the storm destroys any evidence. You're suggesting we take an injured puppy into a bayou during an approaching hurricane to an illegal dogfighting operation that might have law enforcement connections, Robert summarized. James grinned. Exactly. Just like old times in the service, right? Despite himself, Robert felt a smile tug at his lips, the first genuine one in months. Sarah would have done the same thing without hesitation. The rest of the day passed in careful preparation. Robert called Linda with their plan. Securing additional medical supplies for Storm, James made calls to contacts who might have more precise information about Southern Royalty's location. Robert prepared Nala's puppies for temporary relocation to Linda's clinic, a precaution in case Eleanor's inspection turned into something more aggressive. As they worked, Robert found himself reflecting on Sarah more frequently than usual. Her presence seemed to fill the house again as he packed her old camping gear and first aid kits. At one point, he found himself in their bedroom, staring at a photograph taken 3 years earlier, Sarah kneeling beside a rescued pit bull at the county shelter, her eyes bright with the conviction that had defined her. "I'm trying to do what you would have done," he told the photograph quietly. A soft whine drew his attention to the doorway, where Nala stood watching him, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand his grief. "You miss her too, don't you, girl?" Robert said. As evening approached, Storm showed remarkable improvement. The antibiotics and proper nutrition had already begun to work. He managed to walk short distances and had started accepting food directly from Robert's hand. More surprisingly, he'd begun to play tentatively with Nala's puppies, his natural puppy behaviors emerging from beneath the trauma. Robert was documenting Storm's injuries with James's camera when Sheriff Anderson's patrol car pulled into the driveway. The official town inspector, a thin man with a nervous demeanor, followed in a municipal vehicle. "Here we go," Robert muttered, quickly signaling to James, who gathered Storm and retreated to the back of the house. The inspection was thorough but ultimately futile. Robert had temporarily relocated all the dogs to the storm shelter beneath the house, a concrete room accessible only through the utility closet, which he conveniently couldn't find the key for during the inspection. Eleanor watched from the street, her frustration evident as the inspector eventually emerged empty-handed. "Satisfied?" Robert called to her from his porch. She didn't respond, but the look she gave him before driving away spoke volumes. This wasn't over. As twilight descended, the wind began to pick up the outer bands of the hurricane, making their presence known. Robert's weather radio crackled with updated warnings. "Hurricane Eliza now Category 4, mandatory evacuations extended to zones A through C, effective EO 800 tomorrow." "We're running out of time," James observed, studying radar images on his tablet. "The Southern Royalty location I've tracked is here, just southwest of Bayou Noir, but with the storm surge predictions—" Robert studied the map, his military training kicking in. "That area will be underwater by tomorrow night. If they're moving their operation, it'll be tonight." The decision made, they loaded Robert's truck with their gear. Nala's puppies had been safely transferred to Linda's clinic, but Nala herself refused to be separated from Storm. After several failed attempts, Robert relented. "Fine, but you stay in the truck when we reach the location," he told the German shepherd, who regarded him with what could only be described as stubborn determination. As they pulled away from the house, Robert caught a glimpse of Eleanor Thompson standing at her bedroom window, watching them leave. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something unexpected in her expression. Not anger or righteousness, but fear. The truck's headlights cut through the increasing darkness as they headed south, toward the bayou where Southern Royalty conducted its cruel business. The wind bending trees along the roadside like dark sentinels warning them away. In the back seat, Nala had positioned herself protectively around Storm, who slept fitfully against her warm body. Robert gripped the steering wheel tightly, navigating the increasingly treacherous roads. The mission felt right purposeful in a way nothing had since Sarah's death. It wasn't just about saving one puppy anymore. It was about honoring Sarah's memory by continuing the fight she'd believed in. As they approached the turnoff for Bayou Noir, The rain began to fall in earnest fat, heavy drops that hammered the truck's roof like bullets. The first real bands of Hurricane Eliza had arrived, and with them, a sense that whatever awaited them at Southern Royalty, time was running out for more than just their investigation. "You sure about this?" James asked, raising his voice over the storm's growing fury. Robert thought of Storm's scars, of Nala's protective devotion, of Sarah's passionate belief that all living creatures deserved protection. "Never been more sure of anything," he answered, turning the truck onto the muddy access road that would lead them deep into the bayou. The access road deteriorated quickly, transforming from packed gravel to muddy ruts that tested the limits of Robert's truck. Rain hammered the windshield with increasing ferocity, forcing him to slow to a crawl as they penetrated deeper into the bayou. Cypress trees loomed on either side, their moss-draped branches swaying violently in the wind like specters warning them away. 2 miles ahead, there should be a fork, James said, squinting at his GPS. "The left branch leads to an abandoned hunting lodge. My source said Southern Royalty has been operating there for at least 3 months. Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter, his military training kicking in as he assessed their tactical situation. The storm provided cover, but also complications, limited visibility, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present risk of flooding. In the back seat, Nala remained vigilant, her body curled protectively around Storm, who whimpered softly whenever lightning flashed. "We're not just going to walk up and knock, are we?" Robert asked, his voice tense. "These people are dangerous." James reached into his backpack and produced a small camera with a powerful zoom lens. "Reconnaissance first. I want documentation before they move out, proof linking them to Storm. Then we call in the state police." "If cell service holds," Robert muttered, eyeing the signal bars on his phone dwindling to nothing. The isolation that made this location perfect for an illegal operation now worked against their plan. As they approached the fork in the road, Robert killed the headlights and pulled the truck behind a dense cluster of cypress trees. The rain had momentarily lessened to a steady patter, though distant lightning continued to illuminate the sky in brief, blinding flashes. "We go on foot from here," James whispered, checking his camera equipment. "Stay low, stay quiet." Robert turned to Nala. "Stay," he commanded firmly. "Protect Storm." The German shepherd's intelligent eyes met his, and she settled more firmly around the puppy, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep, armed with only a hunting knife and James's camera. The two men moved silently through the undergrowth, their progress slow but deliberate. Robert's old leg injury throbbed with each step, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing instead on the mission. It had been years since he'd done anything resembling a combat operation, yet the familiar tension muscles coiled, senses heightened, felt like slipping into an old, well-worn uniform. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, they caught their first glimpse of the hunting lodge, a dilapidated 2-story structure with boarded windows and a sagging porch. Despite its run-down appearance, the property showed signs of recent activity: tire tracks in the mud, generator hum, and most tellingly, the muffled sounds of dogs. "There," James whispered, pointing to a series of outbuildings behind the main lodge. "Those used to be storage sheds. My source says they've converted them into kennels." Robert's trained eye counted 4 vehicles parked haphazardly around the property, 2 pickup trucks, an SUV with Louisiana plates, and a larger box truck that immediately raised his suspicions. "They're loading up," he said quietly, "getting ready to move before the hurricane hits." James raised his camera, the powerful lens capturing detailed images of men moving between the buildings, carrying crates and equipment to the box truck. The operation had the efficiency of people accustomed to relocating quickly, a necessity in their illegal line of work. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the scene with stark clarity, and Robert caught sight of something that made his blood run cold, a man emerging from one of the outbuildings, dragging two dogs on chains. Even from this distance, Robert could see their pitiful condition, emaciated bodies covered in fresh wounds, heads hanging low in defeat. "Son of a bitch," Robert hissed, instinctively starting forward before James grabbed his arm. "Wait," James cautioned. "We need to document everything before we move. These images will be evidence." Robert forced himself to remain still, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. As they watched, more dogs were brought out, some barely able to walk, others showing the muscular build and battle scars of successful fighters. Each animal was loaded into the box truck with brutal efficiency. "I count at least 12 men," Robert whispered. "Some appear armed. We're outnumbered and outgunned." James continued photographing methodically, his journalist's detachment cracking only when a man kicked a faltering dog so hard it collapsed. "Bastards," he muttered. They were so focused on documenting the scene that neither noticed the approaching footsteps until it was almost too late. A sharp crack, a twig breaking, was their only warning before a flashlight beam cut through the darkness behind them. "Who's there?" a gruff voice demanded. Robert reacted instinctively, pulling James down into the mud as a shotgun blast tore through the foliage where they'd been kneeling seconds before. Their cover blown, Robert made a split-second decision. "Run!" he hissed, pushing James toward the tree line. "Get to the truck!" The photographer didn't need to be told twice. As James disappeared into the darkness with his camera, the evidence Robert moved in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise to draw attention away from his companion. It was a tactic he'd used in Afghanistan, creating a diversion to protect his unit. Old instincts died hard. "Over here!" someone shouted, and flashlight beams converged on Robert's position. He ran through the underbrush, his bad legs screaming in protest, mud sucking at his boots. Behind him, he could hear multiple pursuers crashing through the vegetation. Another shotgun blast echoed through the trees, pellets spraying harmlessly overhead. Robert's mind raced, calculating options. He couldn't lead them back to the truck to Nala and Storm. Instead, he veered toward the bayou, hoping the increasingly heavy rain would cover his tracks. A dead end loomed before him, a steep bank dropping down to the swollen waters of the bayou. No time to backtrack. Robert half slid, half tumbled down the muddy embankment, landing with a splash in knee-deep water thick with debris from the advancing storm. Above him, flashlights swept the bank as his pursuers searched. Robert pressed himself against the muddy overhang, the dark water rising steadily around his legs. The hurricane's approach was accelerating the bayou's flooding, both a threat and a potential advantage. "Spread out! Find him!" a voice commanded from above. Nobody sees our operation and walks away. For 20 agonizing minutes, Robert remained motionless as the search continued. The water rose to his waist, then his chest, forcing him to adjust his position repeatedly to keep his head above the surface. Finally, the voices and flashlights receded, the dogfighters presumably returning to their more pressing concern, evacuating their operation before the hurricane struck. Only when he was certain they'd gone did Robert begin the difficult process of extracting himself from the bayou. The climb back up the slippery bank took 3 attempts, his hands scrabbling for purchase in the mud, his injured leg nearly useless from cold and strain. By the time he reached level ground, the rain had intensified again, falling in blinding sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. Disoriented and soaked to the bone, Robert navigated by instinct, hoping he was heading back toward the truck. The storm's fury increased with each passing minute. Branches torn loose by the wind became dangerous projectiles, and the ground beneath his feet grew increasingly saturated and unstable. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 40 minutes, Robert spotted the outline of his truck through the deluge. Relief washed over him. Quickly replaced by concern, the driver's door stood open, and there was no sign of James. "Nala!" Robert called, approaching cautiously. "James!" A low whine from inside the truck answered him. Nala was still there, still curled protectively around Storm. But of James there was no sign, only his backpack remained, thrown carelessly onto the driver's seat. Robert checked inside the backpack, finding James's satellite phone but not his camera. Had he been captured, or had he managed to escape with the evidence, perhaps seeking a better position to call for help? There was no time to search. The wind had reached dangerous speeds, bending even the sturdiest cypress trees at alarming angles. The access road would soon be impassable as the bayou continued to rise. "We have to go, girl," Robert told Nala, sliding behind the wheel and pulling the door shut against the storm's fury. He tried James's satellite phone, but the storm interference was too great. No signal penetrated the atmospheric turbulence. Robert started the engine, relieved when it caught on the first try. Turning the truck around in the narrow space was challenging, the wheels spinning in mud before finally finding purchase. As they began the treacherous journey back toward the main road, Robert cast one last glance toward the hunting lodge. Through the rain, he could see the box truck pulling away, heading in the opposite direction, the Southern royalty operation evacuating with their abused animals. The drive back to Oak Ridge was a nightmare of deteriorating conditions. Twice, Robert had to stop to clear fallen branches from the road. The truck's wipers struggled against the deluge, and more than once he nearly missed a turn in the near-zero visibility. In the back seat, Nala remained unusually quiet, her body forming a protective barrier around Storm, who had begun to whimper with increasing distress. It was past midnight when they finally reached the outskirts of town. The mandatory evacuation had not yet begun, but many residents had already fled, leaving darkened houses and empty driveways in their wake. As Robert turned onto Cypress Lane, he was surprised to see several vehicles parked outside his home. Sheriff Anderson's patrol car, Eleanor Thompson's sedan, and two unmarked SUVs. "This can't be good," he muttered, pulling into his driveway. Before he could even cut the engine, his driver's door was yanked open. Sheriff Anderson stood there, rain plastering his uniform to his body, his expression a mixture of anger and concern. "Where the hell have you been?" David demanded. "There's a Category 4 hurricane bearing down on us, and you disappear with a banned dog and a journalist known for investigating dogfighting rings." Robert stepped out of the truck, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "How did you—" "James Walker called me from a gas station payphone an hour ago," David interrupted. "Said you were still in the bayou, possibly in trouble. I was about to send a search party." Relief that James had escaped was overshadowed by the realization that they were still in a precarious position. Through the rain, Robert could see Eleanor Thompson standing on his porch, flanked by two men in suits who screamed "law enforcement," even without visible badges. "Who are they?" Robert asked quietly. David lowered his voice. "State police. Eleanor called them about the pit bull. When they arrived, I told them about your connection to Walker and his investigation. They're here about Southern royalty, not just the dog." Robert nodded slowly, processing this information. "I need to get Nala and Storm inside. Storm's injured, and this weather isn't helping." "Robert," David said, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "They have a warrant. They're taking the pit bull into custody as evidence." "Evidence? He's a victim." "Not evidence." Robert's voice rose, drawing the attention of the men on the porch. "Storm needs medical care and stability, not to be treated like a piece of property." "It's out of my hands," David said, genuine regret in his tone. "The state has jurisdiction over dogfighting cases." Eleanor approached, holding an umbrella that did little against the sideways rain. "Mr. Mitchell," she began formally, "you violated town ordinance and harbored a dangerous animal. These officers are here to remove the dog and issue—" Her words cut off abruptly as she caught sight of Storm in the back seat. Even through the rain-streaked windows, the puppy's pitiful condition was evident: the healing wounds, the protruding ribs, the frightened yet gentle demeanor as he pressed against Nala's protective form. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a crack in the rigid facade she'd maintained since the pit bull ban passed. That's the dangerous animal?" she asked, her voice suddenly uncertain. Before Robert could respond, a tremendous gust of wind tore through the neighborhood, ripping branches from trees and sending debris flying across yards. One of the state officers shouted something about the storm intensifying, his words nearly lost in the howling wind. "We need to continue this inside," David yelled, gesturing toward Robert's house. As they struggled toward the porch, fighting the wind at every step, Robert made a split-second decision. Instead of following the others inside, he opened the truck's rear door and gathered Storm in his arms, with Nala leaping out to stay at his side. "What are you doing?" Eleanor demanded, watching as Robert cradled the trembling puppy. "I'm not surrendering him," Robert stated firmly, rain streaming down his face. "Not until I know he'll be treated as a victim, not disposed of as evidence or because of some town ordinance." The standoff might have continued if not for what happened next. A massive oak tree at the edge of Robert's property, weakened by the hurricane's preliminary bans, gave way with a deafening crack. It crashed down across the power lines, sending a shower of sparks into the rain-soaked night before plunging the entire street into darkness. In the momentary chaos that followed, Robert made his choice. With Storm in his arms and Nala at his heels, he pushed past the officers and into his house, heading for the one place they might be safe from both the storm and those who would take Storm away, the reinforced storm shelter beneath the house. The storm shelter was a concrete room barely 12 feet square, built by the previous owner after Hurricane Katrina had devastated the region. Robert had maintained it dutifully, stocking it with emergency supplies, ensuring the reinforced door remained functional, but he'd never actually used it until now. As he secured the heavy metal door behind them, the sounds of the hurricane and the shouting voices above were muffled to a distant roar. Battery-powered emergency lights cast the small space in a harsh glow, illuminating shelves of bottled water, canned food, and medical supplies. Robert gently laid Storm on a folded blanket in the corner, the puppy's labored breathing concerning him. The trek through the bayou and exposure to the storm seemed to have aggravated his condition. His one good eye was clouded with pain, and his small body trembled continuously. "It's okay, boy," Robert murmured, reaching for the veterinary supplies Linda had provided. He administered another dose of antibiotics and pain medication, his hands gentle despite their shaking. Nala paced anxiously around the confined space before settling next to Storm. Her body curled protectively around the puppy as it had been in the truck. Above them, Robert could hear muffled shouts and the heavy footfalls of people searching the house. They would find the shelter entrance eventually. It wasn't particularly well hidden, but he hoped the delay would give him time to think, to formulate a plan that didn't end with Storm being taken away. As he stroked Nala's head, the magnitude of what he'd done began to sink in. He had effectively barricaded himself against law enforcement during a Category 4 hurricane for the sake of a dog he'd known for barely 48 hours. From a certain perspective, it seemed like madness. Yet sitting here, watching Nala tenderly clean Storm's face with her tongue, the decision felt more right than anything he'd done since Sarah's death. Sarah would have done the same thing, he told Nala quietly, probably with less hesitation. The thought of his late wife brought a familiar ache, but for the first time in months, the pain was accompanied by something else, a sense that he was honoring her memory rather than simply mourning her absence. Sarah had dedicated her life to protecting animals that couldn't protect themselves. In his own way, he was continuing her work. A sharp bang on the shelter door interrupted his thoughts. "Robert," Sheriff Anderson's voice, strained but recognizable. "I know you're in there. Open up so we can talk." Robert remained silent, one hand resting on Nala's back. The German shepherd had gone rigid at the sound, her ears alert, a low growl building in her throat. "The storm's getting worse," David continued. "Category 4 now, moving faster than predicted. We've got mandatory evacuation orders for the entire parish. You can't stay here." "What happens to Storm if I come out?" Robert called back, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt. There was a pause. Then, "State police want to take him as evidence. Eleanor's committee wants him removed under the ordinance. Either way, he's going to animal control." Robert had seen enough rescued fighting dogs in overcrowded shelters to know what that likely meant: a frightened, traumatized puppy, evaluated as potentially dangerous due to his breed and background, deemed unadoptable, and ultimately euthanized. All perfectly legal, all perfectly routine. "Not acceptable," he responded. "He stays with me." More muffled conversation from the other side of the door. Then a new voice, one of the state officers, his tone clipped and official. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Detective Lawson. You're interfering with an active investigation and violating multiple ordinances. Open this door immediately or we'll be forced to add obstruction of justice to the charges." Robert leaned his head back against the concrete wall, closing his eyes briefly. The rational part of his mind knew he was being foolish. Storm was just one dog among thousands who suffered similar fates. Yet something in him wouldn't surrender. "I'll come out when I have assurance the puppy will be treated as a victim, not as evidence to be disposed of when convenient," he called back. The response was lost in a deafening crash from somewhere above them, followed by the distinctive sound of splintering wood and breaking glass. The hurricane had claimed another victim, likely a tree falling on the house. Water began to seep under the shelter door, a thin, insistent trickle that promised worse to come. "Robert," David's voice was more urgent now. "The roof's partially collapsed. We need to evacuate now. The bayou's already breached its banks. This whole area will be underwater within hours." The severity of their situation suddenly crystallized. Robert had been so focused on protecting Storm that he'd overlooked the very real danger the hurricane posed. The shelter might withstand falling debris, but if the waters rose enough to submerge the house, they'd be trapped in a concrete box with no escape. As if sensing his distress, Nala whined softly, pressing closer to him. Storm's condition had worsened in just the short time they'd been in the shelter. His breathing was more labored, and his small body shuddered with each exhale. Without proper veterinary care soon, the puppy might not survive regardless of Robert's efforts to protect him. The enormity of his miscalculation hit Robert like a physical blow. In trying to save Storm, he might have doomed them all. Another crash above, louder than the first, and the trickle of water under the door became a steady stream. The shelter's drainage system, designed for groundwater seepage, couldn't handle this volume. Soon they'd be standing in water. Robert? This time it wasn't David's voice, but Eleanor Thompson's, strained and frightened in a way he'd never heard before. Please, Michael's up here. He wouldn't evacuate without checking on you. Her grandson, the boy who'd been attacked. The reason for her crusade against pit bulls, the thought of Michael in danger because of his stubborn stand, horrified Robert more than any threat of legal consequences. "I'm coming out," he shouted, gathering Storm in his arms. "Stand back from the door." As Robert released the shelter's locking mechanism, water rushed in with greater force, quickly soaking his boots. Nala pressed against his leg, anxious but trusting as he pushed against the heavy door. It resisted, then gave way suddenly, sending them stumbling into knee-deep water that had already invaded the lower level of the house. The scene that greeted them was one of devastation. Half the roof had indeed collapsed, allowing rain to pour in unimpeded. Furniture floated like bizarre islands in what had once been his living room, and there, clinging to the staircase railing, was 10-year-old Michael Thompson, his face pale with terror as water continued to rise around him. In that moment, Robert realized he had been fighting the wrong battle. Some things mattered more than principles, more than promises, even those made to Sarah's memory. He had to get the boy to safety, even if it meant surrendering Storm. "I've got you," he called to Michael, wading toward him through the rising water. Storm clutched protectively against his chest, Nala swimming powerfully beside him. The water had risen to Robert's waist by the time he reached Michael, who clung to the staircase railing with white-knuckled intensity. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, darting between Robert's face and the bundle in his arms, Storm, who had gone eerily still, conserving what little energy he had left. "I've got you, son," Robert said, shifting Storm to one arm so he could reach for Michael with the other. "We need to get to higher ground." Michael hesitated, his gaze fixed on the pit bull puppy. Is that a... He's hurt and scared, just like you are," Robert said gently. "And I'm going to get both of you out of here." "Okay." Something in Robert's calm assurance seemed to penetrate the boy's fear. He nodded once, sharply, and allowed Robert to guide him up the stairs to the second floor, where the others had retreated as the water continued to rise. Nala followed, swimming strongly despite the debris-filled current that swirled around them. Sheriff Anderson, Eleanor Thompson, and one of the state officers, Detective Lawson, stood in the upstairs hallway, their earlier confrontation temporarily forgotten in the face of the hurricane's immediate threat. Eleanor rushed forward as they appeared, enveloping Michael in a desperate embrace. "What were you thinking?" she cried, her voice breaking. "You were supposed to be at the evacuation center with Mrs. Landry. I heard them talking about Mr. Mitchell." Michael explained, his thin shoulders trembling beneath his grandmother's grip. They said he was in trouble because of a dog. I wanted to help. Eleanor's gaze shifted to Storm, still cradled in Robert's arms, and her expression hardened. This is what you risked your life for, a fighting dog. Before Robert could respond, the house shuddered violently beneath them. A deep, groaning sound, wood and concrete protesting against forces they were never designed to withstand, filled the air. "Structural failure," Detective Lawson said grimly. "This place is coming down. We need to evacuate now." Through the broken windows, Robert could see the true devastation Hurricane Eliza had wrought upon Oak Ridge. Houses were partially submerged. Cars floated like toys down what had once been streets, and the wind continued to tear at anything not firmly anchored. Their options for escape were severely limited. "My patrol car is still on high ground at the end of the street," Sheriff Anderson said, already moving toward the stairs. "If we can reach it—" His words were cut off by another violent shudder, followed by the sickening sound of the staircase collapsing into the churning water below. Their primary escape route was gone. "Back window," Robert commanded, military training taking over. "The oak that fell, if it's positioned right. We can use it as a bridge to higher ground." No one argued with his assessment. They moved quickly to the rear bedroom, where a massive oak had indeed fallen, its trunk creating a precarious but potentially viable path to the slightly higher elevation of Eleanor's property across the street. "I'll go first," Detective Lawson said, climbing through the broken window. "Test if it'll hold." They watched anxiously as the detective made his way across the fallen tree, the wind and rain making every step treacherous. When he reached the other side and signaled back, Sheriff Anderson turned to Eleanor. "You and Michael next," he ordered. "Stay low. Move slow." Eleanor hesitated, looking at her grandson. "I don't think I can. My hip." The arthritis that troubled her was no secret in Oak Ridge. Without a word, Robert handed Storm to the sheriff and knelt beside Michael. "I need you to be brave," he told the boy. "I'm going to help your grandmother across, but you need to go with Sheriff Anderson. Can you do that?" Michael nodded, though his eyes never left the puppy now cradled in David's arms. "What about him?" "We're all getting out," Robert assured him. "Every one of us." As Sheriff Anderson guided Michael to the window, Robert turned to Eleanor. "Put your arms around my neck," he instructed. "I'll carry you across." Pride and practicality warred briefly on Eleanor's face before she nodded, allowing Robert to lift her. Her body was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way her forceful personality had always disguised. The journey across the fallen oak was harrowing. Twice, Robert nearly lost his footing on the rain-slick bark, Eleanor's grip tightening convulsively around his neck. But they made it, joining Detective Lawson, Sheriff Anderson, and Michael on the relatively stable ground of Eleanor's front yard. "Nala!" Robert called, turning back to the window where the German shepherd waited, alert and anxious. "Come, girl." Nala hesitated, looking back into the room as if uncertain. Then, with a decisive bark, she leapt through the window and navigated the fallen tree with surprising grace, joining them on solid ground. "The dog," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice strange. "Where's the pit bull?" Robert turned to Sheriff Anderson, who stood empty-handed beside Michael. A cold feeling spread through his chest. "David, where's Storm?" The sheriff's expression was grave. He was struggling, having trouble breathing. I set him down for a moment to help Michael through the window, and when I turned back—" Robert didn't wait to hear more. Without hesitation, he started back toward the fallen oak, intent on returning to the rapidly disintegrating house. "Robert, no!" David grabbed his arm. "It's too late. The structure is failing. You can't go back." "I'm not leaving him," Robert shouted, wrenching free. The promise he'd made to Storm, to himself, to Sarah's memory, echoed in his mind. "I won't abandon him before he could reach the fallen tree." A tremendous crack split the air. The remaining section of Robert's roof collapsed inward, sending a wave of displaced water into the air. The house's home for the past 5 years. The place where he and Sarah had planned to grow old together was quite literally falling apart before his eyes. And somewhere inside was Storm. Robert stood frozen, a hollow feeling expanding in his chest. He had failed. Failed Storm. Failed Sarah's memory. Failed himself. The puppy who had depended on him, who had already endured so much cruelty, was now facing a terrifying end alone. "I'm sorry," David said quietly, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. "There was nothing you could—" His words were interrupted by a sharp bark from Nala. The German shepherd stood rigid, staring intently at the churning water between Eleanor's property and what remained of Robert's house. For a moment, Robert thought she was simply distressed by the destruction of her home. Then he saw it, a small, dark shape struggling against the current, its head barely visible above the water. "Storm!" Robert shouted, already moving toward the water's edge. "Robert, don't!" Eleanor called, but he was beyond hearing. He waded into the floodwater, fighting against the powerful current that threatened to sweep him away. The rational part of his mind registered the danger debris carried by the flood could easily injure or kill him, and the water itself was likely contaminated, but he pushed forward regardless, focused solely on reaching the struggling puppy. Storm's strength was failing. Robert could see the small head dip beneath the surface, emerge again, then disappear for longer periods. Just as he was about to dive under to search, a blur of motion shot past him, Nala, swimming powerfully toward where Storm had last been visible. "Nala, no," Robert called. But the German shepherd was already submerging, disappearing beneath the murky water. Seconds stretched into an eternity as Robert waited, his heart pounding. Then, almost miraculously, Nala resurfaced, something clutched gently in her mouth. Storm, limp but still alive. As Nala swam toward him, Robert extended his arms to take the puppy. But before they could reach each other, a massive section of debris, part of someone's deck, torn loose by the hurricane, surged between them. Robert watched in horror as it struck Nala, forcing her beneath the surface with Storm still in her grip. "No!" The cry tore from Robert's throat as he lunged forward, diving into the churning water after them. Underwater, visibility was near zero. Robert groped blindly, his lungs burning, fighting against the current that threatened to sweep him away. His hand brushed against fur Nala, and he grabbed hold, pulling with all his strength toward what he hoped was the surface. They broke into air with a desperate gasp, Robert using one arm to keep Nala's head above water. The German shepherd still had Storm in her mouth, but both dogs were now frighteningly still. With a strength born of desperation, Robert fought his way back to shore, where hands reached out to help him. Sheriff Anderson, Detective Lawson, even Eleanor. As they dragged him onto relatively solid ground, Robert immediately turned his attention to the dogs. Nala was breathing. her flanks heaving with exhaustion. But Storm lay motionless, his small body waterlogged and unnaturally still. "No, no, no," Robert muttered, gently positioning the puppy and beginning CPR with careful compressions of his thumb against the tiny chest. "Come on, buddy. Don't give up now." The others gathered around in a solemn circle, Sheriff Anderson removing his hat despite the pouring rain, Detective Lawson averting his eyes as if to grant privacy in this moment of grief, Eleanor holding Michael close against her side. Even in the midst of a hurricane, with their own lives still very much in danger, they recognized the weight of what was happening. "Please," Robert whispered, continuing the compressions. "Please, Storm." Just when it seemed all hope was lost, the small body beneath his hands shuddered. Storm coughed weakly, expelling water, and drew a shaky breath. His good eye opened, focusing briefly on Robert before closing again, but he was breathing, alive. Robert gathered the puppy close, sheltering him from the driving rain with his own body. Nala dragged herself to his side, her exhaustion evident, but her determination to remain near Storm undiminished. "He needs a vet," Robert said, looking up at the others. "Immediately." In this, Sheriff Anderson gestured to the hurricane still raging around them. "Robert, we need to get to the evacuation center. The road to Dr. Hayes' clinic is underwater by now." "Then we need to find another way," Robert insisted. "He won't survive without help." Eleanor, who had been watching silently, suddenly spoke. "I know someone," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Rebecca Winters. She's a retired veterinarian, lives on Oak Hill High Ground. If we can reach the evacuation center, we can find her." Robert looked at her in surprise. "Why would you help? You've been fighting to have him removed since you found out about him." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Michael, then to Storm, and finally to Nala, who had risked her life to save the puppy. Something in her expression had changed the rigid certainty, replaced by something more complex. "Michael," she said softly, "tell Mr. Mitchell what you were trying to explain earlier." The boy stepped forward, rainwater streaming down his face, his eyes fixed on Storm. "That's my dog," he said, his voice small but clear. "That's Maverick." The simple statement hit Robert like a physical blow. "What?" Michael nodded, his expression solemn. "I found him near the school about a month ago. He was hungry, so I started feeding him. I kept him in the old shed behind our house." He glanced at his grandmother. "I knew you wouldn't let me keep a pit bull, not after what happened. But he was never mean. He was my friend." "The collar," Robert said, realization dawning. "SR7, South Ridge Elementary, 7th Street, Michael confirmed. "That's our address. I put it on him so he could find his way home if he got lost." Eleanor's voice was thick with emotion. "When Michael told me his dog had disappeared during last week's storm, I had no idea. Not until I saw him in your arms. The markings are identical to the photo Michael showed me." Detective Lawson stepped forward, professional interest momentarily overriding the urgency of their situation. "If the puppy belongs to your grandson, how do you explain the evidence of dogfighting, the distinctive scars, the physical condition?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "Michael says he found him near the school. Perhaps he escaped from the dogfighting operation Mr. Mitchell discovered. Or was dumped when they realized he wouldn't fight," Robert suggested, remembering what Linda had said about Storm's gentle temperament. Michael moved closer, his eyes pleading. "Is Maverick going to be okay?" Robert looked down at the puppy in his arms. Storm? Or Maverick, a victim of cruelty who had somehow found his way to a boy's love, then lost it, only to be found again under the most improbable circumstances. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But we're going to do everything we can," as if understanding. Storm lifted his head slightly, his tongue weakly licking Robert's rain-soaked hand. "My patrol car should still be operational if we can reach it," Sheriff Anderson said, taking charge again. "It's on the hill, near the church. If we move now, during this lull, we might make it." The lull he referred to was relative. The wind still howled around them, and the rain continued to fall in sheets, but the hurricane's eye wall had passed, providing a brief respite from the most destructive forces. As they prepared to move, Robert found himself alongside Eleanor, both of them watching as Michael gently stroked Storm's head. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I was so focused on protecting him after the attack. I never considered." "That not all dogs are the same," Robert finished. "Sarah used to say we judge entire groups based on our worst experiences with individuals. It's a human failing." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Your wife sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Robert agreed, the pain of her loss still present but somehow less sharp than it had been. "She would have loved this puppy, and she would have fought for him, just like we're going to do now." As they struggled through the hurricane-ravaged landscape toward potential safety, Robert carried Storm, Eleanor supported Michael, and Nala walked steadily between them, an unlikely family forged in crisis, bound together by the unexpected connection between a boy and the puppy everyone had misjudged. 3 days after Hurricane Eliza had torn through Oak Ridge, the community began the long process of recovery. The storm had carved a path of destruction across 3 parishes, leaving thousands homeless and causing billions in damage. Yet, amid the devastation, stories of resilience and unlikely heroes began to emerge. In the makeshift veterinary clinic set up at Oak Ridge High School, Robert Mitchell sat beside a small recovery pen, his hand resting gently on Nala's head. The German Shepherd hadn't left Storm's now officially called Maverick again's side since their dramatic rescue. The retired veterinarian Eleanor had mentioned, Rebecca Winters, had worked tirelessly to stabilize the puppy, addressing not only the near drowning but also the underlying infections and malnourishment that had plagued him. "His vitals are stronger this morning," Dr. Winters said, approaching with a clipboard. The woman was in her 70s, with silver hair tied back in a practical braid and hands that showed both strength and gentleness honed by decades of veterinary work. "The antibiotics are finally getting ahead of the infection. I think we've turned a corner." Robert nodded gratefully, unable to fully express what her words meant to him. The last 3 days had been a constant vigil, watching the small chest rise and fall, wondering if each breath might be the last. Now, for the first time, hope felt justified rather than desperate. "Has there been any word about my house?" he asked. "Doctor?" Winters shook her head. "Most of Cypress Lane is still underwater. The assessment teams can't get in yet." She hesitated, then added gently, "You should prepare yourself. From what Sheriff Anderson described, the structural damage was extensive. The loss of his home, of the life he'd built with Sarah, should have devastated him. Yet somehow, sitting here beside these 2 dogs who had shown such extraordinary courage, the material loss seemed secondary. Houses could be rebuilt. What mattered was sitting right here in front of him. Mr. Mitchell. A small voice interrupted his thoughts. Michael Thompson stood in the doorway, his grandmother behind him. The boy had visited every day, bringing carefully selected treats for Maverick that Dr. Winters had approved. "Hey, buddy," Robert greeted him. "Come on in." "He's doing better today." Michael approached cautiously, his eyes fixed on the puppy. Though conscious now, Maverick remained weak, his recovery complicated by his prior condition. The puppy's tail thumped weakly against the bedding when he recognized Michael. "Can I touch him?" Michael asked, looking to Dr. Winters for permission. "Gently," she advised. "No sudden movements." With infinite care, Michael stroked Maverick's head, his small fingers tracing the outline of the puppy's ear. The connection between them was palpable, a boy and his dog, reunited against all odds. Eleanor watched from a few steps away, her expression complex. The immaculately styled woman Robert had known before the hurricane was gone, replaced by someone with rumpled clothes and exhausted eyes, yet somehow more authentic than before. "James Walker is here," she said quietly to Robert. "He'd like to speak with you when you're ready." The journalist had escaped the bayou that night, making his way to the sheriff's office with his camera full of evidence. Now he stood in the hallway outside the makeshift clinic, his normally neat appearance disheveled from days of documenting the hurricane's aftermath. "They raided the Southern Royalty operation," James said without preamble when Robert joined him. "State police coordinated with authorities in 3 parishes. They found 27 dogs in the process of being relocated, all in conditions similar to Maverick's, or worse. The evidence we gathered was crucial in securing the warrants." Robert absorbed this news with grim satisfaction. "And the people responsible? 5 arrests so far, including 2 with law enforcement connections. One was a deputy in Terrebonne Parish, which explains why they've been able to operate so long without being caught." James handed Robert a photograph. "This might interest you." The image showed a large female German Shepherd being carried from the Southern Royalty box truck, scarred but unmistakably similar to Nala in markings and build. "DNA testing will confirm it," James continued. "But Dr. Hayes believes this could be Nala's mother or close relative. The timing fits. Nala was rescued from what we thought was a puppy mill 3 years ago. But now Linda suspects it might have been a Southern Royalty breeding facility. They were known to steal promising dogs to improve their bloodlines." Robert studied the photograph, thinking of how Nala had responded to Maverick from the moment she'd seen him at the fence, not with aggression or even mere compassion, but with a specific recognition and protective instinct. "You think Maverick could be from Nala's bloodline, her biological offspring?" "It's certainly possible," James confirmed. The Southern Royalty operation was sophisticated, detailed breeding records, selective traits. When the rescued female saw the photos of Nala and Maverick, her reaction was significant. "Linda's ordered DNA testing. We should know soon." The implications were staggering. If true, it would mean Nala hadn't simply rescued a random puppy in distress. She had somehow recognized her own offspring, separated from her through human cruelty, then miraculously reunited through chance and storm. Robert returned to the recovery area, seeing Nala and Maverick with new eyes. The German Shepherd lay with her head resting near the puppy's pen, her vigilance unwavering. Was it possible she had known all along what humans were only now discovering? Eleanor approached as he sat down again. "Mr. Walker told you about the raid. Robert nodded. Justice is being served. Not just for the dogs, Eleanor said quietly. For Michael, too. She glanced at her grandson, who had fallen asleep in a chair beside Maverick's pen, his hand still resting on the edge. I've spent the past year protecting him from the wrong things while missing what he really needed, which was the chance to trust again. Eleanor's voice caught slightly. After he was attacked, I was so focused on keeping him safe that I didn't see how isolated he'd become. Finding Maverickton, it was his way of healing, and I nearly took that from him because of my own fear. The admission clearly cost her, pride yielding to a painful honesty. Robert felt his long-standing resentment toward her softening. We all do what we think is right at the time, he offered, especially when it comes to protecting those we love. The town ordinance, Eleanor said after a moment. In light of what's happened, I've asked the Emergency Council to review it, to consider exceptions for service dogs, therapy animals, and special cases like Maverick. This was unexpected. Thank you, Eleanor. She waved away his gratitude. It's the least I can do. After seeing Nala risk her life for Maverick, after witnessing your dedication, I realized how wrong I've been. Blanket judgments rarely serve justice. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Anderson, still wearing the same uniform he'd had on for days, now stained with mud and the evidence of countless rescue operations. There you all are, he said, removing his hat. Robert, I've got some news about your property. Robert braced himself for confirmation of what he already suspected, that his home was a total loss. Go ahead. It's not good, David said frankly. The foundation's compromised, and the water damage is extensive. Structurally, it's unsalvageable. Though expected. The finality still hit hard. That house had been the last physical connection to his life with Sarah, the kitchen where she'd cooked Sunday breakfasts, the porch where they'd watched summer storms roll in, the bedroom where he'd held her during his worst nights of PTSD. I understand, Robert said, his voice steadier than he felt. Thank you for letting me know. David wasn't finished. There's something else. When the assessment team was checking the area, they found something unusual. He handed Robert a waterlogged envelope. This was in your mailbox. Somehow it stayed relatively intact. The return address made Robert's heart skip Sunset Heights Assisted Living Facility, where Sarah's mother had lived until her passing last year. The postmark was dated just days before Sarah's accident. With trembling fingers, Robert opened the envelope, carefully extracting the damp contents, a letter, and several photographs. Sarah's familiar handwriting covered the pages, somewhat blurred by water damage, but still legible. My dearest Bobby, it began. I've been keeping a secret that I can't wait to share when I return from visiting Mom. I've been volunteering at the new Service Dog Training Center in Baton Rouge, and I've found the perfect candidate for you. Attached was a photograph of Sarah kneeling beside a German Shepherd puppy, its intelligent amber eyes unmistakable even as a young dog. Nala. Her name is Nala. The letter continued. She was rescued from a terrible situation but shows remarkable resilience. The trainers say she has a natural instinct for detecting anxiety and stress, exactly what you need for your PTSD episodes. I know we said we'd wait until we were more settled to adopt, but she's special. Bobby, I think she could change your life. Robert looked up at Nala, who watched him steadily from her position beside Maverick's pen. For 3 years, he'd believed Sarah had chosen Nala on impulse during a shelter visit. He'd never known she'd specifically selected her as a service dog for his condition, a final gift he hadn't fully appreciated until now. "There's more," David said gently. "Keep reading." Robert turned to the second page, where Sarah's writing continued. "The center has been tracking Nala's littermates, trying to recover them from the organization that originally had them. They suspect it's a dog-fighting ring disguising itself as a breeding facility. One puppy in particular, they called him Maverick, showed the same gentle temperament as Nala. I've included his photo, too. The center lost track of him during a raid, but they're still searching. If they find him, I think he'd make a wonderful addition to our family. I know it's a lot to ask. But imagine mother and son reunited, something beautiful rising from such cruelty. I can't wait to tell you all about it in person." Robert stared at the second photograph, a small pit bull puppy with distinctive markings, identical to the dog now recovering in the pen beside him. Maverick. Sarah had known about him, had planned to bring him into their home, to reunite him with Nala. The accident had prevented her plan from coming to fruition. Yet somehow, against all odds, the universe had conspired to complete her final wish. "She knew," Robert whispered. "She wanted to bring them together." The implications washed over him in waves. The puppy collapsing at his fence hadn't been random chance, it had been the completion of a circle Sarah had begun drawing before her death. Nala's immediate protectiveness, her recognition of Maverick, it all made sense now, Dr. Winters approached with a printout in hand, her expression bemused. "The DNA results just came back from the state lab. They rushed it because of the connection to the Southern royalty case." She handed the paper to Robert. "It's confirmed Nala is Maverick's biological mother." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "That's impossible." "The odds." "Sometimes the impossible happens anyway," Dr. Winters said simply. "I've been a vet for 40 years, and I've seen things science can't easily explain. The bond between animals goes deeper than we understand." Robert knelt beside Nala, burying his face in her fur as emotion overcame him. "You knew all along, didn't you, girl?" he whispered. "You were finishing what Sarah started." Michael had awakened during the conversation, looking bewildered but captivated by the unfolding story. "Does this mean Maverick belongs with you and Nala?" he asked, his voice small with the anticipation of loss. Robert looked at the boy's crestfallen expression, then at Eleanor. An understanding passed between them. "I think," Robert said carefully, "it means Maverick has a very big family now, one that includes all of us." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "My house is gone," Robert said. "I'll need a place to stay while I rebuild. Your place has that big yard, perfect for dogs to recover and train. If you're serious about changing the ordinance, maybe we could show the town what rehabilitation and second chances look like." The proposal hung in the air between them. Former adversaries considering an alliance neither would have imagined possible before the hurricane. "It would be educational for Michael," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "Learning responsibility, seeing the training process, and therapeutic," Dr. Winters added. "For everyone involved." 2 months later, the first signs of recovery were visible throughout Oak Ridge. Debris had been cleared, some businesses had reopened, and the community had drawn closer through shared hardship. On the edge of town, a new sign had been erected on Eleanor Thompson's property. Second Chance Sanctuary, Service Dog Training and Education Center. The autumn sunlight filtered through the trees as Robert sat on Eleanor's porch, watching Nala and Maverick in the fenced yard below. The puppy had grown stronger each day, his playful nature emerging as his body healed. Though he would always bear the scars of his early mistreatment, they no longer defined him. Michael sat cross-legged in the grass, guiding Maverick through simple training exercises while Eleanor watched from a garden bench, her rigid posture gradually softening as dog and boy worked together. The Thompson property had been transformed dog runs, replacing formal gardens. Training equipment scattered across what had once been pristine lawn, a classroom area where Eleanor now taught local children about responsible pet ownership and the dangers of prejudice, both animal and human. As Robert observed this scene of healing and renewal, he held Sarah's water-damaged letter in his hands. Her final gift had been more profound than he could have imagined. Not just the dogs, but a new purpose, a new community, a new family forged from unlikely connections. "We did it, Sarah," he whispered to the autumn breeze. "We brought them home." From the yard below, Nala looked up at him, her amber eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond human understanding. Beside her, Maverick paused in his training, his head tilted as though listening to a voice only he could hear. For a moment, Robert could almost believe Sarah was there with them, witnessing the completion of the circle she had begun. Then Maverick barked joyfully, leaping into Michael's arms, and Nala trotted to the porch stairs, coming to rest her head on Robert's knee as she had done every day since Sarah had first brought her home. Not just a pet, not just a service animal, but a bridge between past and future, between loss and healing, between strangers who had become family. In the distance, construction had begun on Robert's new home, rising from the ruins of the old. But home, he had discovered, wasn't just a building. It was this moment, these connections, this second chance that had begun with a soaked and starving puppy collapsing at his fence, and the extraordinary dog who had known exactly what to do next. When Hurricane Eliza tore through Oak Ridge, it revealed a truth we often forget as we age. Sometimes our greatest healing comes from the most unexpected places. Robert's story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances. Whether you're a grieving widower battling PTSD, a grandmother learning to overcome fear, or a soaked and starving puppy fighting for survival, the walls we build after tragedy, Robert's isolation, Eleanor's prejudice, Maverick's trauma, can be dismantled by the simple, wordless wisdom of a mother's love. As Nala demonstrated when she leapt that fence without hesitation, for those of us who've loved and lost, who've faced our own storms and struggled to rebuild, this story whispers hope. The connections we think are broken can sometimes find their way back to us in miraculous ways. Sarah's final wish, fulfilled through seeming impossibility, reminds us that love transcends even death. As we enter our golden years, may we have the courage to leap fences of our own making, to recognize when we've been wrong, and to open our hearts to unexpected joy, for in doing so, we might discover that our greatest purpose is still ahead, not behind us,